Hello again, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie. We're back for another lesson of our basic online continuation of the Sunday school classes from Jerome United Methodist Church. If you may remember, we're working our way through the Gospels now, and we're in the second section of Matthew. We'll be covering chapters 8 through 14. We'll cover Matthew in 4 different segments. We did the first segment last week, of course, and then we'll continue on. And this is kind of the middle section. And if you remember what we talked about in Mark, a lot of the stories will seem similar because there's a great crossover between the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There's a lot of similarities that they use the same source or sources, probably two. So you will see a number of these stories that you'll have remembered from the Mark episode. They're slightly different. And they use different phraseology, and they're arranged a little bit differently, but a lot of them are fairly similar. And this part of the gospel is, is organized into 5 sections. In the first section, which is chapters 8 and 9, are miracle stories, a series of those. Chapter 10 are the instructions to the apostles as he sends them out to take the message out to the villages of Galilee. The Chapters 11 and 12 deal with questions about the mystery of heaven. Chapter 13 and 14 are parables. And so these are those are the sections that he's got. He starts off the miracle story with the cure of a man with a skin disease. It's not clear to me whether the person had a bad case of eczema or a bad case of psoriasis. They didn't describe it as leprosy. We don't really know what biblical leprosy was. It was probably impetigo, a strep infection, being contagious and all that. But he cures him and then tells him, don't go tell anybody, and then go make the offering that you're supposed to do. We have this kind of cure. And of course, the guy, like everybody else would, goes out and tells everybody, because Jesus is trying to control his fame to keep the crowds under control at this time. Because if you can work these miracle cures, people are going to follow you around. The next one is a very interesting one. This is the centurion's servant. He gets approached by a Roman centurion, which is an officer, a low-ranking officer in the Roman army. And this man's obviously a Gentile. You didn't have Jewish centurions in the Roman army. And he asked him to cure his servant. Jesus says, okay, let's go. And he said, no, you don't need to come. I'm in a position of authority. When the people above me tell me to do this, I do it. The people down below tell me that I tell them to do that, they do it. And here's a Gentile, a non-Hebrew person, a non-Jewish person, who has and he said, all you need to do is say he's cured and he will be. It's a fascinating look at true faith. You didn't have to be Jewish to have true faith. That's really the purpose of this story. And that it's the faith that makes you heal. So Jesus heals him at a distance, didn't have to touch him. Heals him at a distance, and it's a Gentile servant. I'm certain the servant was probably a Gentile also. So it's a very interesting story. And in this situation, it's the faith of the centurion that gets the servant cured. Then he cures Peter's mother-in-law, which means, of course, that Peter was married. You have to be married to have a mother-in-law. It's the only discussion of any of the other apostles, whether they were married or not. I assume most of them were, probably all of them were. That was normal at the time. When you reached sexual maturity, 14, 15, 16, you got married. And marriage in those days was much more of a contractual arrangement than a romantic arrangement like ours is supposed to be anyway in our time. But it means that Peter was married. Then you have 2 of my favorite miracle stories coming up. The first is the calming of the storm. They're in the boat on the Sea of Galilee, which is now called the Lake of Tiberias. If you've been there, it's really a medium-sized, not even that big a lake. And they were in the boat, and a storm blew up, and they thought they were going to sink, so they wake Jesus up, and he can calm the storm. Just tell the forces of nature, stop. And they do. And this is a very different representation of the divine power of the one God. If you're familiar with the ancient religions of the Middle East and everywhere, the gods were the forces of nature. You had a storm god and a rain god and the god of the sea, and the god of the dawn, and god of war. So the gods represented the forces of nature as an explanation of the forces of nature. The Hebrew God, Yahweh, is the name he takes early on, and Jesus, who's part of the Godhead, have power over nature and can control the forces, but they are not the forces. They can control them, they can represent them, they can, like I said, control it here. So it's a very different appreciation of what it means to be divine. Very different than the traditional religion. But here, I've always been impressed that he could just say, stop, and it stops. Now that's power. I'm impressed. And then you have another one when again, I've discussed it as my favorite story, where he's walking along, and the woman who's had the hemorrhage for 12 years, dysfunctional uterine bleeding is probably what the medical term would be. And she's been afflicted with this, and that makes you unclean in the ancient culture. When women were constantly having menstrual flow, they were unclean. They would be isolated during the time of their periods, and then they could come back and join the group when the period was over. This poor old woman had been isolated for 12 years, so she wants to be healed. I think she's embarrassed to ask him, so she reaches out and touches his cloak, and she's healed. Now in Mark's gospel, Jesus, it's very interesting, because that's my favorite description of it. He felt the power go out of him. Very interesting description. It doesn't say that in Matthew's gospel, but it has her healed, and he turns to her, and basically it's her faith that heals her. That, you see what I'm trying to say, that you're not going to get healed if you don't believe. The centurion believed and his servant got healed. The lady believed and she got healed. In other situations where people didn't believe him much, we talked about in the last lesson, then he had trouble healing, where people really didn't believe. And so it's the power is, his power is directed through your faith. If you don't believe, it's not going to work. But that's my second favorite miracle story. And then he has a modification of the Gerasene demoniac. In Mark, it's one person who would break the chains and runs around screaming, clearly paranoid schizophrenic. In Matthew, the story is a bit more subtle, and it has two of them, and it doesn't describe them with the vigor that it does in Mark. And they don't have the name of legion like they do in Mark for multiple demons, devils occupying this poor person. There's two of them. And again, he casts the demons out and puts them into the pigs, and their pigs run down into the lake and drown themselves. And it doesn't have the other details like in Mark, where the crowd comes out and they're kind of upset or awestruck or afraid, and all those things together. But it's an interesting one. Here you have two. Again, even though the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, follow the same pattern, there are often subtle differences in them. So he had the two demoniacs, and he cured them. Then he calls Matthew, the tax collector, to be one of his apostles. This is where the name of the gospel comes from. This is the only gospel that has Matthew as one of the apostles. In Mark and Luke, it's Levi is the tax collector. So this is where the name comes from. There's no claim of authorship or anything like that. It's just the one name that's different here, and they've given it to the name of the gospel. And he follows them, and then he's critiqued by the Pharisees, and you show great tension between the Pharisees and Jesus in Matthew's gospel. Remember, Matthew is the most Jewish of the gospels. It's very clear that Jesus came as the fulfillment of God's promise, the fulfillment of the law, to save the Hebrews from themselves. And by the time this is written, 80 or 85, the temple had been destroyed in 70 by the Romans. So the old, very conservative forces of Judaism, the Sadducees and the temple priests, they were all gone. They were destroyed when Rome conquered Jerusalem and killed everybody and demolished the temple. So the Pharisees, who were always based out in the population, an unofficial group, kind of like being an evangelical now or something like that, they were the ones who preserved Judaism after the temple was destroyed. Well, by the time this is written, the Christianity movement is getting large and significant, and they're starting to separate because the Pharisees reject Jesus as the Messiah, because he wasn't the kind of Messiah they wanted, a warrior conquering king. And the Christians are saying, but he is the Messiah. And so they're separating. And as the tension which existed all along gets much more emphasis in these Gospels, because the groups were really at a divorce. And the tension inside any kind of movement is between when people who accept and reject part of that movement. That produces great tension. So you'll find a constant source of tension between the Pharisees and Jesus. And here they criticize him because he's eating with sinners, tax collectors. I laugh at this one, because every meal I've ever eaten, there was a sinner present. Even if I'm eating by myself, there's the sinner present. And the concept that you can be so pure and righteous that you're free from sin is nonsense. We're all sinners, and we are saved by our faith, but we're not perfect. We should strive for good behavior, but we're not perfect. This shows the tension between the Pharisees, who like to think that they're stridents to the details of the law, how far you can walk on Sunday and things like that, the Sabbath, excuse me. And so those are emphasizing the tension between these groups. So I always am amused with eating with sinners. And Jesus said, who else needs a physician except the people that are ill, rather than the people that aren't? But he's just trying to say, oh my gosh, you guys, you're being way too picky here. Then there's the interesting episode of these two blind men begging by the roadside, and they know that Jesus is coming, and they call out to him as the Son of David. This is a messianic term. Matthew traced Jesus' lineage through his stepfather Joseph back up to David, so he was a son of David, of David's royal house. And Jesus tells them to stop, don't do that, because he doesn't want to be identified as this Davidic Messiah, particularly at this point early in his ministry. So he heals them, but tells them, again, don't talk about this. Of course, they all do. Everybody does. I mean, if you've been blind all your life and suddenly you could see, you're going to tell everybody. Then you go into the next section where he's giving instructions to the apostles. This is very similar to what we talked about in Mark. He sends them out to the villages around Galilee to teach the gospel, teach the message, heal the sick, comfort the needy, et cetera, and tells them, take basically nothing with you. Don't take a purse, no money. In one of the Gospels, he said you can take a staff, and the others he doesn't. Don't take a spare tunic. Don't take any food. Rely on the locals to welcome you. When you get to the village, if they welcome you, you stay with the same person the whole time you're there. That's good. Do that. And if they don't welcome you, as you leave, shake the dust from your sandals. It's an interesting habit, the interesting statement of, I know you reject me and I'm leaving on. Heading on my own way, and I've actually done it a couple times. It's a nice little ritual to go through. If you have a situation where you really feel rejected, slap the dust from your shoes in some fashion as you leave, and that helps clear the frustration and anger about that. And then he tells them, as he's sending them out, expect that you're going to be abused. You're going to be betrayed. You're going to be abused. You're going to be unwelcome. You're going to be reviled for his sake. And you just accept that. That's just part of being a Christian. So stand strong but you must continue to support Jesus, continue to believe in him, and you must renounce your previous life to follow him. And this is part of what you see. You even see it in modern life with people who have severe behavioral problems, criminal behavior, or other types of behavior, addictions and all that. Oftentimes the only way to get them to cure them is to have a religious conversion, where they suddenly come to the Lord, they start to live in the Lord, they put their old life behind them, and that's what many times you really have to do that to get people to where they can get their sinful life under control. And then he receives a message from John the Baptist. John is asking, are you the one? John had regarded himself as the messenger, as Elijah coming to foretell that the Messiah was coming. And John had been thrown into prison by this time by King Herod Agrippa, a real nice guy. And he was asking his followers to go out and ask Jesus. And Jesus doesn't answer directly. He never does in questions like this. He says, Tell him what you see. The blind can see, the cripples can walk, the dead can walk again. Tell him what you see, and that'll let him know. So they go back and tell him, that John was apparently understood what he had here. Then he's attacked by the Pharisees. Well, he actually critiques the Pharisees. They're after him because his people don't fast regularly like John's people did. And he says, wait a minute, you guys were always saying, because John was always fasting and living rough, you were saying that he was a lunatic of some kind. And here you are, when my followers and I are eating and drinking regularly like everybody else, then you're saying we're gluttons and drinkers. You can't have it both ways. And that's just a good point. Some people are never satisfied. Whatever you're going to do, they're going to look and feel hostility toward you. I've always wondered, if Jesus came back now, you read what he says very clearly, that you can't have God money, the family is your family of followers, not the other family. No emphasis on career or all these other things that modern American Christians hold dear to their hearts. He wouldn't get well received at all by the church leaders now. Just like last time, they'd be really upset with him and resentful because he would challenge them. Many of them live quite comfortably in their situation. So I always found that. I just threw that in as a little aside there. Part of he was up. They were always trying to catch him on the Sabbath. They made a point about he and his followers went through a field on the Sabbath going somewhere, and they ended up picking the corn of the cornfield that they were going through. Now, I don't know what this crop was, but it wasn't our corn. Our corn, maize, was domesticated by the Aztecs in Mexico about 1000 AD. What that crop was, I don't know. We used to have a gentleman in our class who's now deceased, Paul Henderlong, who was an international agricultural researcher. He could explain to what it was, and I have forgotten. It was a different type of grain. But anyway, they're critiqued because they go through the field and pick the grain and eat it on the Sabbath, and they're after Jesus. And Jesus says, hey, look, the priests work all the time on the Sabbath. That's their work day. So people do work on the Sabbath. And even when King David's men were starving, he went in and took the sacred loaves out of the temple, which had been reserved for the Lord's use, because his men were hungry. And the law is made to serve us, not to punish us, is what he's saying. And you don't worship the law. You worship the point of what it is about. So it's an interesting thing. And it really refers how much they rejected him. They didn't understand what he was about. And if you look back to the servant songs in the second part of Isaiah 42, 43, 44, when they give kind of a description of the Messiah that was going to come in it, it's a job description for what Jesus was. He's going to be a man of peace and a man of thought. He's not going to be angry and warrior king at all, and he's going to suffer for his people, suffer and die. These are the servant songs in the latter part of Isaiah. Maybe we'll get to where we can go through Isaiah later in things. But this is the perfect prediction of Jesus. Then they start saying that Jesus is Satan, and he's casting out these devils through the power of Satan, or they actually use the term Beelzebub here. Beelzebub is a term of the time for an evil spirit. It's a descendant of the old Baal. If you remember, if you've studied Old Testament, the Canaanite storm god, fertility god, storm god, that they worshiped was Baal, represented by the bull, i.e. the golden calf of the Exodus story. And it has been mutated into this term Beelzebub as an evil spirit living at this time. And Jesus says, wait a minute, how can Satan drive out Satan? And so, he's saying you guys aren't making any sense. Then you have a restatement of the one which is very difficult for me, which is that only blasphemy against the Holy Spirit is the only unforgivable sin. And I said, as I did back in Mark, I don't know what that means. It's never made any sense to me. Other people have tried to educate me about it, and I'm either too stubborn or too foolish to understand it. But I do tell people that St. Augustine didn't know what it meant either, one of the real fathers of the early Christian scholarship. So I'll blame it on St. Augustine, because I still don't understand. he talks about the sign of Jonah. And Jonah is my favorite character in the Old Testament because he acts like a real human being. He's not heroic. He's a human being like the rest of us. God tells him to go to Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, and convert them. And Jonah says, I'm not doing that. I'm heading the other way. And that's how he ends up in the ocean. He gets on a ship, and God sends a storm. And the guys finally figure out that he's the cause of the storm. They throw him overboard. The sea monster swallows him. It's not a whale. Everybody says it's a whale, but it doesn't say whale in the text. And he spends 3 days in the whale, then he's barfed up on the beach. And so the 3 days represents Jesus 3 times, and 3 days in the tomb after his death and resurrection. But it misses the favorite part of the Jonah story. You can't run away from God. But God's everywhere. God's universal. You can't run away. You feel like running away, but you can't. So but he's my favorite character because he acts just like I would. Hey, do this. Oh, I'm not doing that. I'm going the other way. So, and then he's in an area where his family is around, and he says no, his real family are his followers. This is a very interesting point to make, because family is very valuable to us, but if we're isolated from them, we can have other people become like family. In Jesus' situation, it was the people who followed him and recognized that he was the Messiah. You do have a later situation where they do come up. They're in this area. My Roman Catholic Bible has a bit of a difficulty struggling with the question of Mary and the brothers and sisters, because part of Catholic doctrine evolved over the centuries of a very special place for Mary that she does not have in the Protestant belief, that she was born without original sin, that she was remained a perpetual virgin through her life, that she was taken straight up to heaven, and there's the fourth one in there that I'm forgetting. Oh, that she was the mother of God, a term that got people into a huge squabble in the 4th century. That was the first one, Theotokos, mother of God, immaculate conception, born without original sin, perpetual virgin, which means she couldn't have these other children. So the Catholics try to say, well, these brothers and sisters, because they're called brothers in Paul's letters and in Acts, that they were just cousins. I don't buy any of that. But if they want to believe it, that's up to them. I think it's a small issue that really doesn't make any difference. You don't fight over things like this. But that issue comes up there also. Then he talks about the importance of the heavenly values. What is this really? That you have to change your whole life if you're really going to follow Jesus. You have to give up and loving the things that you love, money and prosperity and fame and all those things. And he has some analogies. It's like a person who finds a great treasure in the field, and he takes all his money and buys the field so he can have that treasure. Or he finds a great pearl, and it's worth all the money that he has, and he takes all his money and buys a great pearl. That we should give everything we have, our life, our love, our money, and all that, to follow the Lord. It's actually very good. When he goes back to Nazareth, they identify him here as the carpenter's son in this gospel. And in Mark, they call him a carpenter. It's an interesting small point. Was he a carpenter before he started his ministry? Was he a carpenter's son? They point out his brothers and sisters there. I talked about the difficulty that the difference in belief that the Protestants have in the role of Mary, and the Catholics. She's much more prominent in Catholic Church than she is in our church. And I'm fine with our doctrine about this. Then it finally wraps up with the story of John the Baptist. John the Baptist had been locked up in prison by King Herod Agrippa. This is the son, one of the sons of the old King Herod who slaughtered the innocents at Bethlehem. And he had married his brother's wife, even though his brother was still alive. That was quite the sin. And he was condemned by John the Baptist, and so he locked John the Baptist up. He was afraid to kill him. He wanted to kill him, but he was afraid to because the people thought John was a prophet, and they may rise up against Herod. And he was worried about his popularity, and so the daughter of his new wife did quite the dance at a birthday feast they were having. It's unclear what kind, but you can use your imagination. I can imagine what it was like. And she's called Herodias in the Gospels. In Josephus' history, the historian who wrote about The Jewish ear at this time, after the Great Roman War, called her Salome. I don't know what her real name was. I assume it was Herodias. And she pleases Herod so much that he promises her even up to half the kingdom, whatever she wants, he'll give it to her. She goes over to her mother, and her mother says, "Tell him you want the head of John the Baptist on a dish." So she says that, and he goes, "Oops, I really didn't want to do it," but he does. He doesn't have any hesitation of sending his guard down and having him cut John the Baptist's head off and bring it up. So it shows you what life was like in those days, that the monarchs could just whack your head off if they wanted to. There are some modern rulers who act that way. Stalin killed, 30 million of his own people. Hitler killed 6 or 7 million, lots of people. Japanese killed lots of people in the Pacific War in the 1930s and 40s. So people like that exist. We've tried to control it as best we can. It still goes on. You had the thing in East Africa, and you've had other massacres like that. So it really shows how evil humans are. You really have to control evil human behavior. And it wraps up with 2 of the more miracle stories. The first feeding of the multitude. This is the 5 loaves and 7 fishes. And finally with him walking on the water, which is a very interesting story, that they're out in the boat, and he hasn't he'd gone up in the mountains to pray for some solitude, and he comes out and walks along the water. They see him, they're shocked, they think it's a ghost. He recognizes him, he says, "Just me." And Peter gets out and can walk on the water a little bit, and then he gets nervous and starts to sink. And I thought, I don't have that much faith that I'd get out and try to walk on the water. So it shows that Peter, with all his weaknesses, was a man of strong faith. And that's the end of the story at this point. So we'll stop here. We'll proceed on. We have 2 more lessons on Matthew, and we'll do the next 2 lessons next week. This is Dr. Robert Guthrie. Thank you very much.